Chapter 6 Montana's Gold and Silver Boom, 1862 to 1893. The Big Picture. Gold discoveries triggered a flood of new people into Montana. They used and thought about the land in an entirely different way than the Indian tribes who had made their homes here for thousands of years. Of all the words spoken throughout Montana's past, you could say that one word has changed the landscape more than any other: gold. The discovery of gold in Montana in the 1860s brought thousands of people of many cultures and backgrounds to the Rocky Mountains. These newcomers held different beliefs than the people who lived here. They had a different economy based on gold instead of furs or trade goods, and they used different methods of transportation. They brought fears and expectations that they had formed long before they got here. They imposed their ideas on the land and on one another. They also adapted to their new land, just as everyone throughout time has done. The discovery of gold changed the landscape of Montana. Mines multiplied in the gulches. Towns sprang up nearby. Farms spread throughout the valleys. Ancient trails and pathways became wagon roads. Gold also created a new economic pattern in Montana, the boom and bust cycle. Each gold discovery brought sudden activity followed by decline, then a period of quiet, and then a sudden burst of activity again in another location. This boom and bust cycle defined Montana's economy during the gold rush era, and it continued to shape life in Montana and all across the West for the next 100 years. The first gold rush in the West. California, 1848. The first gold rush in the West started in California in 1848. One man discovered gold at Sutter's Mill, and nearly 250,000 people dashed to California to seek their fortunes. The pattern repeated across the West. Prospectors, who are people who search for gold, usually young, eager, restless men, fanned out into the creeks and gulches of mountain ranges. Merchants and farmers rushed in after the miners to sell them supplies, food, and mining equipment. Each major gold strike triggered a new wave of people. Prospectors worked an area until it played out and quickly moved on. By the 1850s, some of them had made their way to Montana. 3 major strikes in Montana. In the early 1850s, a fur trapper called Benetzi, his métier name was Francois Finley, discovered a small amount of gold in the Deer Lodge Valley. It wasn't much, but it was enough to start people talking. A few years later, brothers Granville and James Stewart found gold nearby, but they ran out of salt and lost 4 horses in a Blackfeet raid, so they decided to keep moving. When they returned, they staked a claim on a spot they named Gold Creek and wrote to their brother in Colorado, urging him to come north. No gold discovery remained a secret long. That letter sparked a small stampede into Montana. Grasshopper Creek made the city of Bannack. On a hot July day in 1862, a prospector named John White and his partner William Eads found gold along a tributary of the Beaverhead River in southwest Montana. The grasshoppers were so thick that the miners named it Grasshopper Creek. Their excitement attracted miners from the whole region. 400 people flocked to the scene that summer. Soon, miners had marked out and claimed the entire length of Grasshopper Creek. They built a little town and named it Bannack City, after the nearby Bannock Indians. By the following April, 1,000 people lived there. Grasshopper Creek produced $5 million in gold dust, worth $90 million today, in its first year. It also produced some outrageous rumors. Some said they could pull up a sagebrush plant, shake the roots out over a pan, and collect $1's worth of gold. Claims like this lured all sorts of people with high expectations. They discovered that mining required endless toil and harsh weather, quote, grueling labor even to men used to hard work, as prospector Ed Mooresman wrote in a letter to his family in 1865. Many spent all they earned just to get by, or arrived at a discovery too late to stake a good claim. As James Morley wrote in his diary in 1863, labor is abundant, and many are disappointed. These disappointed latecomers fanned out across the landscape, seeking their own bonanza, which is a rich mineral deposit. Alder Gulch, almost an accident. In May 1863, 2 prospecting parties left Bannack to search for gold in the Yellowstone River region. This was Crow territory. The Crow had little patience for gold prospectors because they trespassed on Crow land but offered nothing of value to trade. They chased off the first group. When they met the second party of prospectors, the Crow took their horses and equipment, turned them around, and sent them back where they came from. This second party included a man named Bill Fairweather. On their way back to Bannack, Fairweather and his companions camped along a stream in the Ruby River Valley that was tangled with alders, which are thick bushes. After supper, Fairweather scratched at the bedrock with his pocket knife to see if he could find, quote, enough money to buy a little tobacco. Moments later he shouted out, "I found a scad." A scad means a lot. The next day, they recovered $200 worth of gold, which is $2,900 today. Within a few months, thousands of people flooded into Alder Gulch to take part in Montana's richest gold discovery. By the year's end, the gulch had become a string of towns 14 miles long called 14 Mile City. The biggest town was called Virginia City. Last Chance Gulch, just about to give up. As always, as soon as Alder Gulch was fully staked with miners' claims, rumors began to fly about gold somewhere else. Among those who raced after such rumors were 4 men who later were called the 4 Georgians because they used a gold panning technique called the Georgian method. After several disappointing months of prospecting, the 4 Georgians decided to try their luck on a little gulch in the Prickly Pear Valley. That little creek, they decided, would be their last chance. On July 14, 1864, they began working the gulch. Bonanza! They found gold plentiful and easy to remove. By fall, more than 100 cabins teetered on the hillsides of either side of Last Chance Gulch. On October 30th, the community named their new town Helena. Over the next 4 years, Last Chance Gulch produced $19 million worth of gold, which is approximately $221 million in today's money. Hard work and slim pickings. While prospecting for gold in frontier Montana may sound exciting, placer mining, which is when loose gold and nuggets are separated from dirt, sand, and gravel in a creek bed, actually required many hours of backbreaking work. Men moved huge piles of dirt, sand, and gravel by the blister-making shovelful. On cold days, they frostbit their toes and froze their fingers in the icy streams. On hot days, they sweated through attacks of mosquitoes and deer flies. Popular images show grizzled old prospectors with white beards, but the truth is that mining was young men's work. Most were under age 30. As miner John Grannis wrote in his diary, "A year's hard work in the mines has made me feel 10 years older." For all that work, very few miners struck it rich. Most labored long hours for a couple of dollars worth of gold in a day. As 8-year-old Homer Thomas wrote to his grandmother in 1864, "There is plenty of gold, but it is hard to get hold of." Miner Abram H. Voorhees wrote back to his hometown newspaper, "The expenses, toil, and privations incident to a trip to the mining region are not justified by the real condition of things here." He went on to say that not one miner of 1,000 gets rich. Immigrants flood in. By the late 1870s, mining camps dotted nearly 500 Montana gulches. Wherever a miner struck gold, a little mining city appeared. Some of these cities died almost as quickly too, as people rushed off to another discovery. No other strike ever became as well known as Bannock, Alder Creek, or Last Chance Gulch. But together, all the gold strikes changed Montana history. They kept bringing people into Montana. People spread out in towns, camps, and on farms across the landscape. After the gold rush years, Montana was no longer the homeland of American Indian tribes alone. Within 4 years, from 1862 to 1866, Montana's placer mines produced more than $90 million in gold, which is approximately equal to $1.1 billion today. 5 major routes into Montana. Immigrants came to Montana by steamboat, in wagons, on horseback, and on foot. Those who could afford it rode into Montana by steamboat up the Missouri River to Fort Benton. From there, people and supplies still had a long way to go by stagecoach or wagon to the mining camps. Steamboats traveled only during the high water months. The first steamboat arrived in Fort Benton in 1860. The town boomed as a transportation hub for the entire upper Missouri region. Every road led to Fort Benton. Passengers, mining equipment, household goods, food, and other supplies arrived in Fort Benton by steamboat. Freight wagons and stagecoaches met the people and supplies and funneled them in every direction. Then the boats headed back downstream for St. Louis, loaded with bison hides, furs, gold, and travelers returning east. The 4 major overland routes were cheaper than traveling by steamboat, but more difficult. The overland routes followed traditional pathways that native people had been using for thousands of years. From the west, miners and supplies coming from other gold rushes traveled the Mullen Road, a 624-mile dirt track from Walla Walla, Washington, through the Deer Lodge Valley to Fort Benton. Up from the south, people followed the Corinne Road, connecting Corinne, Utah, with Virginia City. So many wagon trains traveled this route that, according to the Jesuit missionary Father Pierre-Jean de Smet, not a blade of grass can shoot up on account of the continual passing. Some people used the Bozeman Trail, a shortcut that branched off from the Oregon Trail at Fort Laramie, Wyoming, and ran north and west right through Crow and Sioux territory. Sioux objections to the trail soon escalated into a war. Across the Dakotas from the east came the northern overland route. It followed ancient trails across present-day North Dakota and entered Montana near Fort Union and the Missouri River. Life in the gold camps. Montana's first mining camps were ramshackle clusters of tents, lean-tos, and crude log cabins with dirt roofs. They were boisterous, dirty, smelly, and loud. Dusty streets turned to knee-deep mud in rainy weather. Horse manure was a part of daily life. Sanitation for humans was not much better. In Bannock, butcher Conrad Kors let his hogs forage on Main Street. Still, the camps quickly took on a settled appearance. Merchants built stores, hotels, and saloons to serve the miners. Some people called this mining the miners because the merchants pursued the miners' money as eagerly as the miners pursued gold. Selling merchandise was usually more profitable than mining. It was easier work, too. In its first year, Virginia City had a grocery store, a bakery, barber shops, dry goods stores, blacksmith shops, a newspaper, a post office, a telegraph office, several churches, a school, and the gold assayer's office, who determined the value or quality of gold. In every town, the saloons and dance halls served as social centers for the young, single men who made up most of the population. But mining towns offered other forms of entertainment too. Along the muddy streets of the gold camps, You could find prize fights and literary societies, gambling houses and opera companies, social clubs, singing classes, and French lessons. 2 years after Virginia City started, the town advertised 2 theaters that offered plays, acrobatic performances, and live music year-round. 7 years after Helena was first settled, there were 200 pianos in town, all brought by wagon. Mining camps relied on freight trains, which were strings of freight wagons pulled by teams of oxen or mules, for necessities too. At first, most of the miners' food was shipped in by freight train. Coffee, sugar, flour, bacon, beans, and salt made up a miner's diet. Potatoes and dried fruit were rare treats. Food was expensive because shipping prices were so high. Later, as farms and ranches spread into the valley, they supplied welcome vegetables and beef to the towns. Bad weather and other transportation problems sometimes caused food shortages. In 1864, early snows cut off food supplies and caused a flour riot in Virginia City. People panicked as the price of flour for a 100-pound sack rose to $100, even $150, about $1,300 to $200 today. A troop of men went door to door to collect all the flour in town and distribute portions to everyone to make sure no one went without. Settlers used the land in a new way. The gold rushes changed the way people used land in Montana. Because Indian people did not build buildings, the non-Indian settlers assumed the open lands were up for grabs. Private ownership of land was very important to the settlers. Owning and controlling land was one way of gaining wealth. This basic understanding of the land was very different from the way hunter-gatherers of the northern plains had used the land for thousands of years. Towns sprang up in the middle of tribal territory, often at the crossroads of important Indian trade routes. Towns and mining claims cut off Indian people's access to traditional lands and water sources. Immigrants carved wagon trails through Indian hunting grounds. Their horses and cattle grazed the roadside to dirt, which interrupted bison migration patterns. Farmers plowed up other bison grazing grounds. Domesticated animals spread diseases to bison and other wildlife. Outside the mining towns, settlers carved fertile valleys into farms to raise crops and cattle to feed the growing communities. Farmers protected their crops with fences, controlled access to water, and claimed ownership over vast areas of Indian hunting and camping grounds. These farms had an even bigger impact on the landscape than the mining operations and the gold camps did. Imagine how your community might change if thousands of new people moved into the area who did not understand the local people or their ways of life. This huge wave of new people affected Montana's native cultures deeply. Whenever conflicts arose, the settlers expected government soldiers to protect them. Increasingly, the settlers' prejudice, which is a preformed negative opinion against Indian people and their misunderstanding of Indian cultures, exploded into violence. For example, in 1864, nearly 500 gold prospectors stampeded into the Sun River area in Blackfeet territory. Most did not find gold and left right away. One group of miners stayed on, but they were not prepared for the severe winter. When cold weather hit, they nearly starved. A Piegan Blackfeet chief named Little Dog took pity on them and shared antelope meat with the miners. Despite the help they had received, several of the miners killed 4 men of Little Dog's band. After that, Blackfeet military groups chased off gold seekers who trespassed on their lands. Settlers also adapted to the land. When the settlers arrived here, they adjusted to their new circumstances. They built houses from whatever was available, usually logs. For roofing, they lined up poles made from small trees and topped them with layers of dirt and sod. In the first few years, there were no banks. People used gold itself as money. In 1865, an ounce of gold dust was valued at $18, which is about $230 today. Miners carried their gold in pokes, which are little buckskin sacks. Every business had a little scale for weighing the dust. People also adjusted their ideas to fit their new circumstances. For example, merchants opened their stores on Sundays, something they never would have done back home, where Sundays were saved for church. But miners worked every other day of the week, and most only came into town on Sundays. Children were quickest to adapt to their new land. They did not carry their parents' attachments to homes far away. Instead, they forged their own ideas and attitudes about the land and people that made up their world. They also enjoyed more freedom than they would have had in more established towns. A blend of many cultures. The landscape of Montana during the Gold Rush era echoed with languages of every kind. In addition to Indian tribes who spoke many languages, there were French, Métis, Spanish, Canadian, American, and Mexican people involved in the fur trade. The gold camps attracted Chinese, German, Dutch, British, and Irish people. The accents of the Southern Confederate and the Northern Yankee echoed here too, as people displaced by the Civil War streamed into Montana to build a new life. Many Jewish people came west to the gold fields, mostly as merchants. African Americans flooded west too. Some were freed slaves, some were Northern free blacks seeking new opportunities. An African American woman, Sarah Bickford, later ran Virginia City's water utility. One important group who added to the story of Montana was the Chinese community. In 1870, nearly 2,000 Chinese people, mostly men, lived in Montana's mining camps, making up about 10% of the total non-Indian population. Yet their story is so seldom told that they are often called the forgotten pioneers of Montana. Chinese settlers bought claims that other miners considered worked out and recovered the gold that was left. Others ran restaurants, pharmacies, boarding houses, stores, and laundries. They often sold fresh produce from their gardens. Some were doctors. Most of Montana's Chinese immigrants came from a poverty-stricken region of China. They came hoping to make their fortunes in the West and return home. Some did return home. Others stayed and raised families and continued to help shape Montana cities and towns for many decades. For some people, the multicultural mix of the gold camps added to their fascination with Montana. Many of the new settlers made friends with their new neighbors. Some married people of other cultures and raised families. Others simply enjoyed the interaction. In October 1865, 1,000 Nez Perce, Salish, and Pend d'Oreille people camped near Helena on their way to hunt bison. Townspeople challenged them to horse races and riding competitions. However, many settlers brought prejudices with them. They discriminated against people who were not like them. Some businesses hung out signs barring American Indians from entering. In 1867, thugs murdered a black man in Helena to keep him from voting in an election. In some towns, black children were not allowed to attend white schools. In many places, the Chinese were burdened with extra taxes, run out of mining camps, robbed of their claims, and sometimes attacked or murdered. In 1882, the United States passed the Exclusion Act, barring Chinese laborers from entering the country. This law lasted 60 years. Law and order in a new land. If you were starting a new society in a new place, what rules would you want to have? The miners brought their rules with them from other mining camps. As soon as miners staked their claims, they set up miners' courts to make sure their claims were protected. They elected judges, a recorder to keep track of claims, and sometimes a sheriff to enforce the laws. They could not rely on faraway governments to help them. The miners' courts settled all kinds of cases from business disputes to murder trials. A jury usually decided ordinary cases. A criminal case often attracted the entire community. Sometimes the whole crowd served as jury and also decided on the sentence. Usually, court was held on Sunday so everyone could come. But the miners' courts were not equipped to handle the violence that came to the gold camps. Frontier justice and the vigilantes. The gold fields attracted all kinds of people, including criminals. One of Montana's most famous criminals was the handsome, charming Henry Plummer. Plummer was elected sheriff of the Bannock district. He gathered a secret group of followers around him who were suspected of robbing stagecoaches of their gold shipments and murdering miners carrying gold. Citizens shuddered at the violence. They were all new to the area. Few people knew one another. Besides, they just wanted to work their claims. Then in December 1863, a well-liked young Dutchman named Nicholas Thibault was murdered. The community rose up in outrage. Organized crime, they decided, required organized crime fighting. A group of men investigated, and within a few days, they accused a man named George Ives of the murder. A crowd of 1,500 gathered on Nevada City's main street for Ives's trial. A young attorney, Wilbur Fisk Sanders, carved an unforgettable place in Montana history by volunteering to prosecute Ives. Judge Don Byam sat in a wagon, and a jury of 24 men stood in a half circle around a big log fire. The air prickled with danger. Outlaws in the crowd fingered their handguns, eager to see Ives go free. The jury found Ives guilty. In the silence that followed, witnesses heard several clicks as men in the crowd cocked their weapons. Sanders boldly faced them down. He said to the jury, "Men, do your duty." Ives was hanged that night. This dramatic event led members of the community to form a vigilance committee. Vigilance means keeping a careful watch. These men, called vigilantes, hung 24 men in the next month, including Sheriff Henry Plummer. Vigilantes were key players in the turbulent early days of the mining camps. Right or wrong, vigilantes acted as a kind of police force in a region hundreds of miles from official law enforcement. The new communities of Montana cried out for their own permanent and accountable government. Montana builds a territory. As towns grew up, people needed public services like roads, schools, mail delivery, and law enforcement. They needed a tax system that would pay for these services. They needed laws, police, and record keepers to help people sell businesses, protect property, and settle estates. They needed a government. Before 1864, the land now called Montana was part of Idaho Territory. Its capital was Lewiston, across the Bitterroot Mountains from Bannock and Virginia City. Lewiston was too far away to provide government services to the gold camps of the northern Rockies. The new settlers believed that this wealthy region could develop faster if it was its own territory. The government needed Montana's gold. Montana Territory was born in the 4th year of the Civil War, which went on from 1861 to 1865. The Civil War was a long, bloody, expensive conflict that killed 620,000 soldiers. The federal government, the Union, fought against 11 southern states, the Confederacy, which means an alliance of states. The main issue was whether states had the right to secede, which means separate, from the Union if they disagreed with U.S. policies like ending slavery. Community leaders in the gold camps and mining towns knew that the federal government needed gold to fund the war. Gold from other discoveries across the West already was going to help the South. President Abraham Lincoln did not want Southerners to control the West and its gold. Congress sponsored special wagon trains from northern states into the West along the northern overland route to encourage Northerners to move into the gold fields, too. In 1863, President Lincoln sent a well-respected lawyer named Sidney Edgerton to Idaho Territory to be Chief Justice. Edgerton immediately saw how valuable these remote gold fields would be to the Union. He also agreed with the other settlers. The gold camps needed their own territorial government. In January 1864, Edgerton boarded a stagecoach bound for Washington, D.C., to ask Congress to create a new territory. He carried $2,500 in gold nuggets sewn into the lining of his coat, immense nuggets wherewith to dazzle the eyes of congressmen, he wrote later. He knew that dazzling congressmen with gold would convince them to create a new territory in the gold fields. On May 26, 1864, Congress passed the Organic Act, the law that created the Montana Territory. President Lincoln immediately appointed Sidney Edgerton the first governor of Montana Territory. Montana got its name from an Ohio congressman who liked it because it came from a Latin or Spanish word meaning mountainous country. He may not have known that the Spanish already called this region Montaña Relucientes, which is a Spanish translation of what some American Indians called the Rocky Mountains, Shining Mountains. What is a territory? A territory was like a junior state, the first step towards statehood. A region qualified to become a territory of the United States when its non-Indian population reached 5,000. When its non-Indian population grew to 60,000, the territory could apply for statehood. In a state, people elect government leaders, but the federal government appointed leaders to run territories. The President of the United States appointed a governor, a territorial secretary, and 3 judges who would make up the territorial court, which is similar to the Supreme Court of a state. The voting citizens of the territory, non-Indian male citizens over age 21, elected representatives to the legislature, the branch of government that passes laws, and 1 territorial delegate, who was a representative of the people, to the U.S. House of Representatives in Washington, D.C. This territorial representative could present the territory's needs to Congress, but he could not vote. Territories did not have a representative in the U.S. Senate. An important thing to remember about the new Montana Territory is that while it claimed Indian lands, it did not include Indian people. They were expected to obey territorial and federal laws, and many Indian people lived in mining communities, but they had no representation in either the territorial or federal government. This meant that American Indians could be punished, even put to death, for breaking a territorial law. Yet territorial laws did not protect Indians from crimes that whites committed against them. Many conflicts arose between Indians and the newcomers over land, hunting rights, the use of water, and the right to travel through certain areas. The Civil War shaped early Montana life. The Civil War was far away, but it influenced life here in many ways. People on both sides of the war felt passionately about issues like slavery, states' rights, and freedom. They named Confederate Gulch, Yankee Flats, and Unionville to express their sentiments. Southerners first named Alder Gulch Varina, after Varina Davis, the wife of Jefferson Davis, who was the president of the Confederate States. Northerners changed the town's name to Virginia City. When President Abraham Lincoln was assassinated in 1865, many Southern sympathizers rejoiced, to the horror of Union loyalists. Young Molly Sheen of Virginia City danced for joy with her classmates, until she got home and received a stern lecture from her Unionist father. Civil War politics continued to drive the political life of Montana Territory. Most of the new Montanans were Democrats, and many of them were loyal to the South. The president and his administration were Republicans. They appointed many Northern Republican governors. Some Republicans, like Governor Edgerton, would not compromise with Democrats at all, because they thought all Democrats were traitors. After Edgerton, most of Montana's territorial governors were strangers to Montana and totally unfamiliar with its land, people, and problems. This made citizens feel that their government did not represent them very well. All this led to many fights over politics in Montana. It took a long time for Montana and the rest of the nation to recover from the trauma of the Civil War. Gold led to silver. By the early 1870s, most of the loose, relatively easy-to-get gold in the stream beds was gone. Miners knew that rich veins of gold lay deep within the cliffs and rocks of mountainsides. Getting at that gold would require a different method of mining altogether. How would you get gold out of a rock mountain? Gold and silver lie in veins that are embedded in the surrounding rock. Usually, the rock around gold is quartz, so recovering the gold from the rock is called quartz mining, which is hard rock mining. Quartz mining required large, expensive equipment that was difficult to transport and required many workers to operate. Placer mining could be done by individuals, but only big businesses could tackle quartz mining. Big companies formed to bring in mining equipment and hire workers. The miners dug deep shafts and tunnels into hillsides. They dug ore, which is rock containing precious metals, from inside the shafts and sent the ore out in buckets or carts pulled by mules. These loads of ore went to a stamp mill or dry crushing mill, which usually stood near the mine. The stamp mill was a huge rock crusher that turned cabbage-sized rocks into fine sand. At first, stamp mills only crushed the rock so it could be shipped to other places for refining, which is separating precious metals from rock. Later, mine workers washed the crushed rock with chemicals to refine it further before shipping out the gold ore. Some stamp mills also yielded other precious metals, like silver, copper, and zinc, that appeared in the same rock as the gold. To early gold miners, these other metals were a nuisance, but later they became even more important than gold. The problems of transportation plagued the quartz miners. In 1864, a mine owner named Turnley bought a 10-stamp quartz mill and tried to ship it to Grizzly Gulch, near Helena. The first train it was on was burned by robbers. The wrecked mill was repaired and shipped by steamboat to Fort Benton, but the steamboat broke a shaft. The crew finally unloaded the mill at Cow Island, 120 miles downstream from Fort Benton. Then Turnley had to hire a freight train to haul the stamp mill in pieces to Grizzly Gulch, where it arrived a year and a half after Turnley bought it, costing more in freight than the mill had cost to purchase. Quartz miners, merchants, and most travelers could not wait until railroads came to Montana. Butte and the Silver Boom. In the 1870s, Butte's placer gold mines began to dry up. Miners deserted the camps for richer grounds. By 1874, so many claims had been abandoned in the West that Congress passed a law requiring miners to perform a certain amount of work on their claims before January 1st, 1875, or lose them. Many just let their claims expire. Not Bill Farlin. On New Year's Eve 1874, the day before the deadline, Farlin went back to one of his old claims near Butte. Here he had found quartz rock bearing silver, gold, and copper nearly 10 years before. When Farlin sank the first shafts into the hillside, he struck a silver vein that was rich beyond belief. Dying as a gold camp, Butte sprang to life again as a silver camp. Miners scrambled to attract investors to help them build new mines. Workers from around the world flocked to Butte. railroad companies started competing to lay the first track into Montana. Other silver mining towns sprang up: Granite, Castle, Phillipsburg, Elkhorn, Glendale, Nyhart, and Hecla. In 1876, the United States Mint began buying Montana silver to mint into coins. Across America, coins made from Montana silver jingled in people's pockets. By 1880, Montana was producing more silver than gold. Then in 1880, the first railroad entered Montana Territory, the Utah and Northern Railroad. The Great Northern and the Northern Pacific came by different routes a few years later. Once the railroads arrived, mining companies could bring in heavy equipment. They could ship ore and other raw materials back to eastern markets far more quickly. Large-scale quartz mining developed in Montana only after the railroads came. Boom to bust, the pattern continues. Silver mining repeated the same boom and bust cycle that began with placer gold mining. Silver discoveries created a sudden burst of economic activity and triggered a new flood of immigrants into Montana. But the boom lasted less than 15 years. In 1893, the government canceled its silver contracts and the silver market collapsed. Overnight, silver mines across the West closed. Many of Montana's silver mining towns were abandoned as people fled to find new jobs. People left furniture behind, curtains in the windows, and children's toys in the yards. Just a few years later, silver prices rebounded. Some of Montana's silver mines sprang to life again. Ghost towns once again became bustling communities. The lives of mining towns always relied on prices and conditions determined far away. Like the placer gold rushes, the silver boom changed Montana in many ways. It drew huge investments from people outside the region. Silver connected Montana's economy with the nation's economy. Montana became strongly influenced by people and corporations far away from here. This pattern of influence by outside interests continued long after the silver boom was over. Two ways of life converge. In the 30 years after prospectors struck gold in Montana, mines, towns, road networks, and steamboat ports developed across the territory. The nation's economy came to rely on the wealth of Montana's resources. In 1870, there were 20,595 non-Indian settlers living here, with more arriving every day. By 1890, the number of non-Indian settlers had risen to nearly 143,000. The settlers celebrated the growth. To them, every new town, school, mine, or church spoke to Montana's bright future. But as the newcomers put down roots, Montana's Indian tribes looked for ways to protect their territory. How it worked. Placer mining required simple tools and hard work. Placer miners used simple tools. They purchased no land and needed little money. All they needed was a pick, a shovel, a pan, some water, and plenty of muscle. Miners looked for places where erosion might have washed gold nuggets or flakes out of the hills and into the stream beds. The term placer mining comes from the Spanish word placer, meaning sandbank. Picking and panning. The placer miner explored a creek bed or gully, driving his pick into a sandstone ridge looking for color. At the creek's edge, he dipped a ridged pan into the gravel, swirled the dirt and gravel around in the water, and checked the bottom of the pan for gold flakes or nuggets. Because gold is heavier than dirt and rock, it sinks to the bottom of the pan, while the sand and stones wash off the top. Staking a claim. When a miner found some gold, he posted a notice claiming a certain length of the creek. This was called staking his claim. The claim gave him the right to work that stretch of gully and to keep whatever gold he found there. The claim also guaranteed access to water from that creek to use in his mining operation. Water was critical to placer mining. Rocker and sluice. If a spot looked promising, the miners shifted to larger operations so they could wash the dirt and gravel faster. They used simple tools, water, and gravity. The rocker was a large wooden bucket that rocked back and forth like a cradle. Miners shoveled dirt into the upper end, poured water over it, and rocked it back and forth. The finer material washed through a hole in the bottom, and the gold collected in ridges, called cleats, along the bottom of the rocker. The rocker was a good two-man method. With one fellow constantly shoveling gravel, and the other rocking the rocker, a pair could process 200 buckets of gravel a day. If there was enough water nearby, the men built a sluice, which is a long wooden trough, with an open top and cleats along the bottom. They shoveled dirt and gravel into the top end, and let water wash the rocks and mud out of the lower end, leaving the heavier gold behind in the cleats. Sometimes they added mercury to the sluice, which chemically attracted the gold particles. Hydraulic mining. When the easy pickings were gone, they turned to hydraulic mining, using pressurized water to cut into a hillside to wash dirt and gravel down into a sluice box. This took cooperation from several workers. They built canals and ditches to bring water from a stream to the mine site. The water would be collected into a hose that was wide at the opening, but narrowed as it went downhill, so that by the time the water came out the other end, it was highly pressurized. It was like mining with a fire hose. Hydraulic mining was fast and efficient, but extremely damaging to the land. It tore off topsoil and left barren, gravelly hillsides.